Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Please come right in. Come right on in. My name is Jocelyn McDougall, and I am a facilitator and a convener and a strategist, and I work with The Tech We Want. And I want to make sure I get our byline correct here. The Tech We Want is a responsible innovation network for tech visionaries building alternative economies rooted in shared power and prosperity. I wanted to start us off in a good way by acknowledging the land that we're on. So we find ourselves today gathering and conversing on the land of the Ute people. We want to pay our respect and our gratitude to the elders of these nations, both past, present, and emerging, for the stewardship of these lands. I am going to pass it over to my friend and colleague Nicole to tell us a little bit about the conversation we're going to have today. Take it away.
Thank you, my love. Hi, I'm Nicole Allred from Media Network, and I just want to kind of lay the groundwork for this conversation. So we're in the middle of a cultural shift, and it's something that we should really be paying attention to. So for over like a decade, we've really had pop culture where it's really worshipped tech founders. You know, we had the Social Network film, which I was looking up what year it came out, and I was like, oh gosh, we're old, or I'm old. But it came out back in 2010. The Social Network had us thinking about this lone genius working from his bedroom, building empires from a dorm room, and disruption was the name of the game, right? Move fast and break things was what everyone needed to do, is the mantra. I lived near Silicon Valley at the time, and I remember developers were literally gods. Like, they were the people you needed to have on your teams, they were paid more, like they were everything. And then something kind of shifted. In 2022, we had The Dropout with the Theranos scandal. We had We Crashed. We had the Anna Delvey movie, and I think there was this sort of shift into this notion of, oh, things maybe aren't as they seem. And so now in 2026, we're starting to move more into this reckoning. The Social Network sequel is coming out, which is called The Social Reckoning, which is all about the whistleblower. And there's been so many whistleblower biopics. And so we're really in this sort of scrutiny phase. But even with all of these stories and the show, what I keep coming back to is that actually this is really about power. These stories are really about power. Who has it? Who doesn't have it? Whose stories are being told? What stories actually have the power to inspire others? We know none of this is happening in a vacuum. We haven't moved. We haven't made this switch by themselves. I think if there's anything we know in 2026 is that everything is connected, right? We have workers across industries that are feeling less security than ever. Especially, I mean, I remember as well TikTok videos where we saw big tech companies and employees being laid off, like in the TikTok videos. AI is really reshaping what it looks like to make a living, especially for creatives. And there's this growing recognition, though, that the stories that we tell don't just reflect power, they actually have the ability to shape it. And there's an opportunity here, right, especially for the folks in these spaces. There's a reason that people wanted to become astronauts after watching Star Trek. There's a reason that Top Gun came out and Navy recruitment literally increased. What we see on screen literally creates possibilities for what we think can happen in our own lives. And, you know, one question that I had was, what happens if we tell different stories, not just about the leaders or not just about the singular? What if we tell stories about the collective? What if we made that shared power feel as inevitable as tech disruption once did? And so that's what we're here to dig into.
All right, everyone. So we're going to have this conversation today about power and about shifting power and distributing power through storytelling. So that's why we've chosen this setup. We call it a fishbowl. These are the fish, and you are the bowl, right? Okay? And the whole purpose of this setup is so that we can have a participatory conversation. We're going to start off with a bit of a conversation that does feel a little bit more like a typical panel, where we're going to kind of get some inspirational talk from our invited guests here. And then we're going to move into the kind of audience participation. We're going to spend the majority of our time doing that. Here's how it works. Anyone in the room can come up and sit down and become part of this conversation. And the way that we'll run it is that we want to always have 4 people in the center and 1 empty chair, so that at any time somebody can come and sit in the empty chair. And when that happens, someone who is one of these 4 opts to leave. They might leave because they feel complete, but one of the four will leave, so that we collectively maintain a group of four people in the middle, and people keep transitioning in and out. And that way, the hope is that we end up with a really robust and nuanced conversation about how we tell different stories about power in the tech sector.
I want to hear more from you. And so this is a way for us to collectively hear all of the wisdom in the room. So it's chill, don't feel scared. It's going to be good. Let's just start by going around to our wonderful thought starters. So I want you to tell us who you are, what you do, and then I want you to think about one other thing as you introduce yourself. So we're discussing this swing, right, from worshipping tech founders to putting them sort of more on trial. But again, this is more about power. Who has it, who's losing it, who never had it to begin with. So from your particular vantage point, why do you think this shift is happening now in our current moment?
Hi, I'm Meredith Levine. I'm a fanthropologist. I do audience development research and strategy work, specifically with an emphasis on fans, fan culture, fandom, and participatory practices online. And when I'm thinking about power and this power shift, the lens I think about is fandom, and I think about the whole history of this. And fans have always been making fan works. And I think what's happening now is we have these new tools for organization and conversation. And as internet and platforms have evolved, fandom has moved from the back burner to a little bit more of the forefront of pop culture conversation. And the means of production has also gotten less expensive. So not only can people consume stories in a different way, but also it is much more accessible to speak. And underserved markets serve themselves, and they find each other. And they're speaking, and now they get to speak more loudly.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Avriel Epps. I'm a computational social scientist, a professor at the University of California, Riverside, where I study the impact of AI, machine learning, on humans and how we develop throughout our lifespan. I also run a nonprofit organization called AI for Abolition, where we're trying to build power with and around artificial intelligence, specifically with marginalized communities. When I think about this shift in narrative around power and technology, I think the first break in that facade culturally had to do with Cambridge Analytica and the 2016 election. Right? That was when we first saw, oh shit, these are not like these neutral new playgrounds for us. They said that we were going to democratize media. And in fact, they data mined all of us and stripped a lot of our political power. I think the narrative now has a lot to do with the rise in inequality, political instability globally, and mental health crisis that the world, but especially this country and Western countries, are facing. And many people look at those three things. Oh, we could also talk about climate change as kind of the fourth aspect in this polycrisis. Many people look at those four things and say, the tech industry has a lot to do with all of those. And if we follow the money and the incentives, even if it's a conversation just about corporate power and corporations, well, who are the 7 biggest corporations in the world, right? So it doesn't take a huge mental leap for people to say, those guys seem to have started some really big problems that we're now all being forced to reckon with, while we are also now under the threat of increased surveillance.
So as I said, I'm Nicole Allred, and I lead our culture and narrative change work at Media Network. And when I think about the answer of why now, I think there's a lot of just questioning of systems that are already in place. And I think particularly with storytelling, AI has opened a lot of doors for, I think, people to enter into the Hollywood system that they could not approach before. I spoke to this incredible musician who was like, no, he made this really great album, like an AI, like visual album. And it was about his Nigerian American heritage. And he's like, I would never have been able to get anyone to fund me to make this. And now it's out there and it's creating impact. I also speak to creators and film writers and directors who are like, absolutely not. I will never use this AI as part of my creative process. And there's some in between as well. There's some people who are like, I'm not sure. I really believe that if we don't take part in this, then the tech companies will sort of impose it on us. Right? We need to be part of steering it so that we have a say. Who does the system serve? Who is being kept out of it? Who is protecting the power that they've always had? And who is having power for the first time? And also, how do we ensure that people who have worked really hard to create music and cartoons and art in their own image, like how do we ensure that we're protecting that as well? When we think about the stories that center the founder and whether we are worshipping them or whether we are sort of scrutinizing them, it's still about these people. It's still about one person. It's still about Holmes. It's still about Zuckerberg. We're still watching their story. But I guess I'd say, how do we get off of this pendulum altogether, right? There's so many other people who make that possible. What does it take to make stories about collective power, about working people, just like regular people, about communities? How do we make that feel relevant, possible, doable?
Income equality. I think a lot of this has to do with the tech founder narrative is an aspirational narrative. The unicorn narrative of venture capital is an aspirational narrative of being able to escape velocity into social upward mobility. And I think that is one of the systemic flaws. And I see this in the creator economy a lot too. Being able to have a sustainable career in the arts, so I think this has to do with union labor. Also, I did a report for a client a few years back about the state of blue-collar jobs and who's portraying the jobs that we have career gaps for in America. And it's not Hollywood. It's people who actually have those jobs telling their own stories. So on TikTok, you can find plumbers and handymen and people who are solar power installers and millennials who said, F this life, moved to France, bought a dilapidated chateau and are renovating it themselves one step at a time. Like, you can find all of that because people are telling their own stories, and it's a lot harder in systems where writers need to write what they know. I was talking with Amber and Amanda on Wednesday about the power of the ensemble cast and why ensemble cast is really good for fandom. And ensemble cast is really good for fandom because you get multiple perspectives and people can identify with whomever they want and whomever feels good to them, and there's more opportunity.
It's human nature to always want to see upward mobility and to always want to see people doing better than you because we can see a dream or have a dream for ourselves.
Yeah.
Is that something that we always need? Like, are they the kind of stories that we have to have?
Yeah, I think utopian thinking. So I grew up as a baby fangirl in the era of dystopian franchises with female heroines. I grew up in relative peacetime. Like, I was a teenager in the Obama administration. And when I look around today at what's going on, and when I think back in the history of film and television, I think about utopian spaces of Star Trek Next Generation, of Gilmore Girls, of Ted Lasso, of romance as a genre where it's not necessarily fantasy, but it is socio-emotional fantasy, of imagining a world of being seen and heard and understood by somebody else and finding love. There really is, if you can see it, you can be it culture. It's been studied in the medical field with the impact of Grey's Anatomy on women who go to med school. And so I do think it's really important from a creative perspective to build a world you want people to live in so that people can say, I want to live here, and reverse engineer it.
We also have to recognize that all of us in this room, given the culture that we grew up in, probably don't have the best skills to tell collectivist stories because we live in an individualistic society. But there are a lot of cultures all around the world that intimately understand collectivism in a way that we do not, and we can learn from them.
Hell yeah. Like, one of the things that we're seeing in the fandom spaces are cultural import from East Asia, which is inherently collectivist. And the way that fandom expresses over there is much more like joining a union. It is collective action to a goal. If you've ever encountered what BTS Army can do, like buying tickets to Trump rallies and ghosting, and like there's a lot of yes, and I think we're seeing it being imported at a scale that we haven't before.
So yeah, I think it's important to remember that like we don't know everything there is to know about telling stories as Westerners, and we have things to learn from the global South and also from the East. So on the topic of billionaires and collective power, it seems like maybe if you don't think about it that deeply, that billionaires have a lot of power, right? They're in control of our modes of communication. They have huge say in what happens in our government. There's fewer than 3,000 of them in the world. So like just by like sheer numbers, like there are a whole hell of a lot more of us. There is also a scrappiness, a creativity, a desperation to move the needle in some way. Like we have an upper advantage. There are way more of us than there are of them. That gives me a lot of hope in the power of community organizing.
You've built these communities online to make AI feel really accessible and approachable. I think there's definitely a narrative that says, I'm not an AI expert, I'm not a tech expert, I don't get to have a say. And that's something that we're actually trying to push back on.
For me, it feels more about the tension of participating in a platform while critiquing a platform. That's the tension. I talk a lot about tech refusal. You know, you could switch your email provider and that'd be like one less like dollar you're giving to Google every day, you know? I will say that this idea that the majority of Americans read at or below and comprehend at or below a 6th grade reading level drives a lot of my strategy. It's why I wrote a kid's book about AI bias rather than like a grown-up book about AI, because I care more that parents and working people with kids and grandparents with grandchildren learn about these things.
What are these other stories? How do we tell stories about tech? How do we tell stories about tech that are not just about the founder? How do we tell stories about tech that do not make tech inevitable? People like us have the capacity to contribute to and shape the future of tech. What are the kinds of stories that we can tell that help us think about collective power, that help us think about agency? How do we make these stories sexy? Like, how do we make them so that collective power, for example, is the next disruption?
So I'm really inspired today because you guys have just jogged a memory. The first year I was here at Sundance was 23. I met a black filmmaker who said she had made her feature film on $25,000. And I came out of film school with this entitlement that I probably did not acknowledge. And 3 years on, having made a feature film myself for far less, I kind of see her to be the first whisper into the wind. For a person like me, or coming from a country like mine, it's very hard to be sold on the dream of a beauty queen. You know, once you subscribe to that, you're finished. You asked, who is to tell the story and how do we tell it? I think we are the story, and the quicker we recognize it, the better.
So when you think about budget and creating what you can with what you have, how did that factor into like your process and your narrative and your idea of what this story is going to tell?
I'm an engineer turned filmmaker, unfortunately, but I feel, there are 10,000 people who contribute to that code base, and none of them are acknowledged except the person at the top. To tell my little girl that you can't do what you want to do just for lack of money or access, that seems defeatist. Because the stories that inspired me, because I started film after I had children. And nobody said you can do this. Nobody ever said to any mother you can do this. And so for me, it just became about leaning into what felt urgent.
In our conversation, I was talking about Stranger Things. Because for me, the storyline, there's one kid who has, no spoilers, but there's one kid who has way more power inside of him than he realized. And it's kind of revealed at the last minute. And I thought about other stories that, like Matrix. I was always super into the Matrix and Neo and how he had this latent power. And so when you're talking, I'm thinking as well about like these stories, especially in Stranger Things, it's not just about one person's power. It's about everybody's power, and they come together and they make the thing. And so what you were saying just really resonates. I'm going to leave now because you joined.
I'm here now. Wow. Okay. Well, actually, I felt like compelled to join because like I'm hearing that like you were introducing yourselves and you were talking about children. Like you wrote a children's book. You're talking about your little girl. I'm curious for all of you and maybe someone else in this room too. Like, what are the stories you might want to tell like today's children?
That is the thing that I'm constantly thinking about. Like, what am I doing today in my work and my life that's going to allow my child and his peers to inherit a better future?
I want to address the children's media thing also. This is like a lot of core fandom memory comes from youth culture. A lot of people's first introductions to feelings of belonging outside of an immediate family happen through mediated environments in fandom. If you ask me today what my favorite fandom is, it's different. But if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have said adult fans of Bluey without children. Because of the socio-emotional skill building and development, and I think this is something that Sesame Street does, and I think we got into this STEM place of glorifying tech founders because we got into glorifying STEM, because this is where upward mobility and employment was. And I think that when we think about what do we want to teach children, I think it's kindness. I think it's socio-emotional skill building. I think it's how do you apologize and forgive.
I think a lot of what I'm hearing here has a lot to do with values. And I'm very cautious about cognitive distortions, particularly dichotomous thinking, us versus them. There's a lot of frustration that is expressed towards the billionaires and the tech founders, and I understand where that comes from, but one thing we have to ask ourselves is we didn't choose, they're not our representatives, right? Billionaires are individuals who have taken advantage of a system that we've all sort of bought into. It's a shared social construct, and that system has rewarded them for their ingenuity. And the real issue is what's the governance and what are the incentives, right? Because we have to also recognize that capitalism has been responsible probably more than any other social construct for lifting people out of abject poverty than any other form of control. I'm from Nigeria, and I can tell you that technology has done tremendous impact on perception, changing narrative. A young African who is 13 today doesn't have to worry about changing the perception. It's sort of implicit that, yeah, you know Afrobeats music, or yeah, you've seen Black Panther and you understand where those cloths come from. And a lot of that has been the result of social media, TikTok, Instagram, the democratization of music and access to music through Spotify and things of that nature. So I just caution that we think of the worst case and the worst attributes of technology and capitalism and its reward and its incentive systems, and we often don't realize how much it has helped so many people. This is not to say that there should not be a referendum on its successes, but I think what we lose in our agency to cause those changes, that we focus so much on the bad that we don't allow ourselves an opportunity to, repair. Yeah.
I think that goes hand in hand with your comments around the stories that we tell children. And when I think of that, I think of the importance of actually preparing kids to understand and engage with the real world. And I think about the stories that I grew up with as a kid and the things that really inspired me. Like, these are stories that had many, many layers to them. There was like an initial layer that I could understand as a kid, and I got to learn more about the systems that those stories represented as I grew older. And like, I grew up in the 90s. Erin Brockovich was like a big movie. It was character driven. It was rich in narrative. It wasn't beating me over a head with a guilt trip about like, you can't have oil or gasoline or whatever, right? It was showing me that there are both winners in the world of like capitalism, right? But there are people who have really meaningful negative impacts that they're associated with, right? And I think about, like, as we were trying to talk about what are the films that actually keep you, I don't know, keep with you and change your narrative over time. These are character-driven films. They're not all documentaries. Like, occasionally you'll find like a Blackfish or like My Octopus Teacher, right? Or something, and you're like, oh, this is really incredible. I'm like really deep into it, right? But when's like the last time you found one of those around like workers' rights and collective ownership? Like, the stories that I think need to be told are stories like the Battle of Bel-Air Mountain. Like, what a crazy, wild action movie would that be that exposes some of the challenges of how we see capitalism affecting us every day and the everyday heroism that it takes for individuals, not like one single person, right? But a whole collection of people who are all risking small parts of their comfort and their current identity to be able to make meaningful change in workers' rights. And if there's a narrative that like resonates with people today, I think it's that one. And I think it should come from people who lived it, who have that oral history as part of their family. And I think that if we're not paying attention to filmmakers and creators that are outside of major media hubs, I mean, I grew up here. Utah's like a wonderful place that's rich in history, and so many people can tell so many great stories. But until they've got access to funding, they're not going to. And so talking about the excesses of capitalism, right? Like, acknowledging that philanthropy can play an incredible role in not just backing documentary film production, but also this narrative-driven work, I think is a really under-discussed part of like trying to build up the narratives that we're trying to build today.
Dustin and I had a great start to this conversation over there when we were sitting next to each other about these Trojan horse narratives that maybe have an agenda hidden within, but are delivering the message through entertainment and maybe reaching the types of people who wouldn't necessarily be reached by literature or teachers or parents. And maybe they'll seek out all of the studies and data and educate themselves as a result. But sometimes it takes something like Stranger Things or an anime or a story that is just reminding you that there's a power inside you that can be channeled into something meaningful. And being able to translate that into actionable goals and connecting with community and building change. And I think it's also what you said. What's your name?
Abiola.
What you said about the nuances and not making it just a two-sided dichotomy is really powerful too, because I think we need to encourage young people to learn to self-regulate and examine our relationships with technology and media. And yes, the problems with tech billionaires are going to persist, and it's a testament to our future that there are great organizations, including ones of young people like Design It For Us and the work that Omidyar Network is doing, who are fighting for better legislation and duty of care laws from the people in charge of tech. But also, we need to start on the individual level and the community level and build that awareness and learn how to use it in ways that are positive and learn how to avoid the harmful effects and have peer-to-peer conversations that can, in the intersection of mental health and media usage, actually save lives when we're able to talk about that stuff. And so I think finding those stories, making them sexy, making them entertaining and accessible, and finding a way to reach all the different types of people who might be affected by these issues is a really powerful step for any creators to take.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm Amanda. I'm a filmmaker, co-founder of Fangirl Central, which is a fandom consulting company and multimedia company with my sister Amber over there. We translate and amplify fandom for intersectional fans. So when I say intersectional, we are talking about intersectionality within identity, so sexuality, race, gender, things like that, but also between fandoms, because I think as much as we segregate ourselves based on all those other types of identity, we also tend to do that as fans. You never think of a sports fan or a One Direction fangirl in the same sentence, but they can be one and the same. So just wanted to frame what I'm about to say with that. But I completely agree. I think documentaries can change people a lot, but the two that you mentioned that were very transformative were both about sea creatures and not about humans. I think that people tend to empathize with animals over people that are not like themselves. And so in that nature, stories can be the most powerful thing in the world. You empathize with a character because you get inside their head in a way that you can't with a real person. So as much as you want to empathize with someone who's a documentary subject, you can't really know them and you shouldn't really know them based on just a movie. So I did want to say that. I also came into The Circle because The Social Network is my favorite movie. And I think I completely agree with putting these tech billionaires on pedestals is not really the story to go, but I have seen The Social Network millions of times, and I think we forget that that movie is actually a cautionary tale about the dangers and how it can divorce you from your humanity from the beginning of that movie to the end. At the end, yes, you empathize with Mark, but you're kind of like, I don't want to be that guy. He loses all of his most important relationships in that movie, and I think that one could write a PhD dissertation on the fact that that movie's a love story between him and Eduardo. I'm not going to get all fangirl and say that it's romantic, but there are many different types of love stories. And the devastation of that movie lies in the complete destruction of their relationship. And Mark is a completely different person after it. But I think that it's very telling, and I think that we can all rewatch The Social Network to see why we don't want to become tech billionaires and why we should want to keep our humanity. And I think that more stories should be told from the perspective of maybe not the cautionary tale of the asshole in the center of the movie, but the people around him that he affects. So those are just my 3 cents.
I'm currently working on a docu-series about a fallen billionaire. And so I've been for the last 3.5 years very deep in this world of who are these billionaires, what are they all about? And I similar to, I think he left now, but I take a very similar position. I think sort of this us versus them is very dangerous. It creates like a really weird divide between the haves and the have-nots because it's really a huge gradient, right? There's so much gray in the middle. Just because you've got 900 million doesn't mean you've got the same mindset as one or the other. I think it's really about power. This concept of the unchecked power in capitalism is very strong in the United States. I'm from Austria. Austria is a much more collectivist society. But at the same time, collectivism is also not just a super simple answer, right? Like you look at China, and both present-day China and Mao Zedong China are two very powerful versions of collectivism that are both incredibly dangerous and incredibly murderous. So just because we've got this hardcore laissez-faire capitalism here doesn't mean that the opposite is actually the answer. And I think the real question is this regulation of power, whether it's the regulation of the power of a collectivist state or the power of a billionaire. It's about who are these people and how are they being regulated. And if we leave it all up to their own regulation, you might have people like Omidyar who does the right thing with that money, and you have people like Elon Musk who does the complete wrong thing with that money. And so I think us as a society, that's the power of the collective, is to demand laws that then regulate that unchecked power by a capitalist billionaire. And in our docuseries, there's this other layer that I think is also really important here, right? Like we're talking about a system of belief. What do we believe in, right? The United States does not believe in collectivism. Otherwise, there would be a universal healthcare system. To me, that is the ultimate sort of like litmus test. If a society has reached at least a moderate level of collectivism is when they figure out that, hey, if you have a collectivist healthcare system, that is way better for every single participant in the system except for the insurance companies. And so as long as that doesn't happen, I think a collectivist dream in the US is kind of, it's a dream, it's not a reality, right? And I think it's all these people that can work on this, whether it's in storytelling, but I think ultimately we are telling stories about individuals. That is the way that the human brain processes stories. We identify with one person or multiple people, but it's always a one-on-one relationship with us and the screen. So I think it's important to take that into consideration, that we are always looking at individual people when we identify with stories. And we can tell stories of rebels and people that rise up as individuals and then form a collective. But ultimately, we'll always look at that one individual that inspires us.
I think that you can look at multiple individuals within one ensemble, though, to inspire you. With collectivism, the dangers of it, I feel like we're leaning into like collectivism versus cult behavior and just kind of mindless following people, which we have in America and which exists across a lot of different cultures. But I do think that we as people are able to empathize with multiple different people within one story. I think that's why stories like The Avengers works, or like for all the people in the audience who grew up with Barbie, like Barbie versus Bratz, for example, there's multiple girls in Bratz that you can identify with versus just one Barbie. Like if you're not thin, white, and blonde, you might be able to identify with her, but you might be able to identify with someone else a little bit more. That's why I think that ensembles are important, because you can identify with someone different each time you return to a story. And multiple different people in the audience might have different favorite characters than just the main character, especially if you have an ensemble where there's not just one main character. Because I think individualism in storytelling and the hero's journey, it's a very Western way to tell a story, but there's a lot of different ways to tell stories.
Just to go off of that too, Toby and I were speaking on during our sort of breakout session, the piece of media that we encountered that inspired us to take action. And we're both New Yorkers, and I have a friend who's on Zoran's media campaign, and one of the things that I watched that changed my mind and that brought me into action in the real world was his rollout. Starting back in fall of 24, when he went to Queens and asked people why they didn't vote for the Democrats in the presidential election, and why they voted the way they did, and watching his campaign rollout of someone who was not just a politician, but someone who appeared and was willing to appear as a New Yorker, as someone who sorry, I get like a little emotional about it, but just because it is exciting to feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself, and something that is leading to a sense of hope and wonder and like a better life, where dignity is not something that people are like aspiring to, but that it's the baseline. And it feels so often in the United States that we're not permitted to dream bigger. And he really brought about the sense of like, no, we can just do it. We can just make it happen. And 2 weeks in, we got universal childcare in New York, and like it's a start. It's something. It's a huge step, and to me that sort of like matter of fact, like the ownership of our democracy and what's great about it is sexy. I think that there is a like. I'm walking down the street and one of those big LCD panels has him talking about like cold weather advisories, and like I'd never seen a mayor do that, and I was like, I didn't know that was possible, and that to me is sort of at the heart of what we're talking about when it comes to democratization and pushing back against notions of top-down control. Is one, showing what democracy is capable of and what a collective sensibility can bring, the benefits that it can bring, and this aversion to siloing and cutting people out of decision making or as I said, like dignity or group decision making.
I was just to both of your points. I think one way to inspire people about what's going on with technology and the dangers of it is to make movies that aren't about technology at all, but that remind people of the power of collective activism. And that movie inspired you. I produced a movie called Summer of Soul that Questlove directed about the Harlem Cultural Festival, and obviously that movie came out at the right time in terms of people having been inside with COVID and being reminded of the power of music, the power of community, and so just wanted to say that.
Thank you for that movie.
Facts.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah, I think we were talking about the types of stories. I think there's this untapped well of two things that we know inspire people, and that's mythology and military history. I know that sounds weird, but follow me real quick. Black Panther is essentially mythology and military history. And it's also a vision for the future, but it really taps into like this mythos of like Boston and all this other cool stuff. And then like this culture that has this really cool cultural identity. And then if you even think about Coogler's Sinners, right? You look back, everybody's scene that they talk about the most is when there's that like timeline dance through of all the different history and so on and so forth. The problem is when we think about mythology, as Westerners, we tend to think of either Norse or Greek, and there's so many other types of mythologies out there. And like the movie that we talked about, well, at least me, was The Woman King. That was the story that really, really like inspired me, and I was fired up after. I couldn't talk after I left that movie. Why? And it was because you had this powerful military that was small and it was theirs, and you also had this powerful mythology that they were basing all of their actions under. And those are the type of things that inspire us, because as people, like narrative stories started off as mythology stories, right? I think if we go back to that old school understanding of things, we could really start to develop and mine for new types of stories that could actually resonate with a broader group of people and a more niche group of people so they can see themselves in that mythos.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, and I want to follow up on your point. And one of the things we talked about in panel prep was, and one of the things that I guess I talked about in panel prep, I'm going to say me because this is the perspective I come from, is there are a couple ways to think about this. There's the literalism of telling the literal story of the literal problem, and then there is divorcing input from outcome, and the idea in fandom that when you get a community of people who care about each other because of shared identity, and then put them all in a space where they understand that they're a community that cares about each other because of some aspect of identity, fandom is an identity, then they do cool shit in the world. Like some of my favorite fandoms are John and Hank Green. They're internet personalities. And their fandom has raised $25 million to build a maternal mortality center in Sierra Leone. Their fandom has successfully bullied tuberculosis testing manufacturers to lower their prices internationally. And this doesn't have to do with the content, or most of the content, that John and Hank make. It's very different. We saw like Swifties off of the High of the Eras tour, without prompting from Taylor Swift, go and collectively organize voter registration drives and get out the vote for Kamala Harris, just because they were like, this is a vibe, let's continue the vibe. I love everybody here. What are we doing with this? Where are we putting this energy? We're gonna put this energy towards voter registration. And so there is this power, because fandom is a tool for building a collective identity through whatever, through mythology, through ensemble casts. And I think that one of the things that I get on a soapbox and talk about a lot is one of the way that fandom develops is time spent over time. This is why I think documentaries struggle a little bit, is because you see something and it's compelling or it's not compelling, and you can either take action immediately or move on, versus when you build relationships over time with content, the way that like whatever your favorite show when you were a child or teenager did that you watched for what felt like the rest of your entire childhood, but maybe was 1 to 6 seasons, like that feeling of forever and that feeling like relationship with the content and relationship with the community. So like someone was here saying like one-to-one relating, and I'm like, but also in fandom there's one-to-many relating and many-to-many relating, because at a certain point when fandom breaks containment, it stops being about the thing that they were fans of in the first place and starts being about the community that people are belonging to as a result of their shared love.
I'll say one more thing and then I'll get out of the circle. But to your point that like documentaries and your earlier point about utopias, I think that's the reason that documentaries and dystopias about tech don't really inspire anybody to change, because dystopias just kind of make you depressed. You're like, okay, yeah, that could happen. The Matrix is happening right now. And it kind of draws us inward instead of outward. Whereas, something like Star Trek or even the movie Her, like talking about technology where it's not so insidious, but it could be a little bit like you could imagine it in the near to distant future work better for inspiring action and inspiring civic imagination, which is something that a fellow colleague of ours in Fandom, Henry Jenkins, talks about a lot, is like fandom as inspiration for activism, and collective imagination can inspire us to envision a future that we don't see already.
I feel like that's a perfect segue to why I came to sit down in the circle.
And I'm going to interrupt you real quick. And I can't because we know each other. It's cool. We're going to hear your comment, Ania, and then we're going to move to a close. So I just want to give us a little heads up that that's what we're going to do, but go for it.
And then I'm also going to preface my thing by saying that I'm going to kick it to you, Meredith, because I'm going to ask you to share something I've heard you talk about before, which is that I think also, we talk about what we want to be true about the future what we want the future to be like. And then I always think about like what must be true for that to be possible. And I think about that in my job at Omidyar Network in terms of like actual like social and economic infrastructure, like, oh, how do we change clauses in contracts to produce like different results? Or, how do we create new funds that do things for new purposes? But I also think about the behaviors of people, right? Because there's no magical wand of like corporate structure, entity, legal form that like you do and then everybody all of a sudden just like is going to be doing the best version of humans. Like you put a human in any utopian vision and then watch what happens. But I feel like one of the things that I've heard you talk about before, Meredith, that I thought was so fascinating and I also think about a lot in relation to fandoms is the way that it creates a safe container for people to practice like certain ways of being that they wouldn't normally be able to do in their everyday lives. And I would like really love to hear you talk about that because I think that that's such an important facet of like how do we actually get into safe environments where we get to actually practice what we need to be in the future in order to have the one that we want.
Yeah. Thank you so much for teeing that up. I'll give you context. I worked on a longitudinal study of fandom about what is universal about fans, no matter what they're a fan of, and it comes down to a few things, one of which is a place to practice emotions. And this is universal, no matter what you're a fan of. You could be a fan of the W, you could be a fan of Black Panther, you could be a fan of anything, and the stories are emotionally compelling that you go through a very human experience in consumption. The practice of being a fan, also, you wind up in a community that knows you have this shared love, can check you if you need to be checked, know that it's happening with love. Fan fiction writers open themselves up to beta readers, and there's an infrastructure for critical feedback of work, and there are whole hosts of containers, and I'm gonna gender this a little bit, but in the dominant form of masculine fandom for the last 2 centuries, which has historically been sports, there's a whole range of human emotions that I don't think the fandom thinks about or talks about in the experience of that consumption and participation of shared loss, of frustration, of immense joy, and that is a place to feel a very human experience. And like, if you were, I don't know if anybody's ever been in a story hole where their show ends and then people emerge and are like, what now? Where do I go? And then they can turn to their fellow fans and say, well, you're in this with me. What do I do now? And then take recommendations and migrate through culture in this shared container. And one of the benefits of fandom is you have something to look forward to, and the flip side of that is you have to wait. So it's both excitement and patience, the 2 sides of that coin. And yes, it really is a powerful experience. Did I dive deep enough into what you wanted? I know we had a whole conversation about it at another event.
That's wonderful, so thank you.
Yeah.
I want to say one quick thing to go back to your tech platform that goes back to what Meredith said.
I'm going to just let you say one quick thing, and then we're going to just, after one quick thing. Okay, great.
Okay, cool. The thing that you guys all talked about, that we talked about, but we've danced around, is how does tech raise that collective fandom? How do we get those stories told? How do we put a spotlight? How do we highlight these stories? Every single one of you talked about stories that you've either produced, created, done, but how are we getting spotlights on it? And what we were just talking about is, because I'm the oldest person in the room, there was this thing called Usenet groups in the old days, and those were very democratized. Everybody, multi-fandoms. What they were talking about and what my son was part of was Tumblr. It was pretty democratized. You would have multi-fandoms talking to each other. I don't have an answer, but that was the question I wanted to put back to you is, what is that tech going to be that allows us to shine a light across fandoms and raise voices?
What indeed? That'll be for the next panel. Thank you so much for that. Sure. And I just want to say thank you so much to everyone. I'm going to pass it over to Nicole. We were going to do a lightning round close, but I think we need to, I'm trying to respect the beautiful organizers of the Impact Lounge who have to flip this room before the next panel. But Nicole, I would love for you to segue into particularly the question we had about how do we fund these different kinds of stories?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the Alternative Futures Fund a little bit, guys. Because I feel like I heard themes of how do these stories get made, what moves us and compels us to action. The narrative stories start as mythology, that just like blew my mind, Jason. And then another thing that came up for me was like not focusing so much on the bad that we forget the good and what we're building towards. And so I wanted to talk about the Alternative Futures Fund, which is an initiative that Media Network is launching this year that supports storytellers that are telling a different narrative. So everything that we've discussed today. We have these stories about what's going wrong, about power hoarding, about job insecurity, about creative work that's being scraped without consent, which are all very important things. But we're missing the stories that are showing what we're building towards, like what is possible when we have collective agency over these issues. And so we're funding stories that can make collective power feel sexy and tangible and something that we need to have. And so I would just say, come chat to me afterwards if you're interested. Grab one of these little things. And that's it. I'll hand back over to you, Jocelyn.
Thanks, Nicole. And all I have to say is thank you so much. This was a real experiment for us today, and I really appreciated everyone who stepped in, who took a chance. And I don't know about y'all, but I was loving this. This was fantastic. It was so rich and so different than what it would have been if it was just three voices at the front of the room. So thank you so much for coming with us on this journey. If you like what you see and you happen to be in Austin for South by Southwest, our team with the Tech We Want and Omidyar Network will be hosting The Lighthouse at the Belmont in South by Southwest, and we'll be doing more conversations just like this one because we are all about democratizing these conversations and the stories that are helping us build the future where we can all thrive. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Impact Lounge and Sundance. Thanks, everybody.